In 1960, the average South Korean earned less than someone living in Ghana. Let that sit for a second, not slightly less, not comparable, less. Ghana was ahead, and South Korea was a country that had just been cut in half, bombed into rubble, and left with almost no natural resources, no industrial base, and a population living largely in poverty. 60 years later, South Korea is home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and Kia. It has a higher per capita income than Spain. Its capital city has faster internet than almost anywhere on earth. And it pulled off this transformation faster than any country in recorded economic history. So what actually happened? Because the official story, the one about hard work and education and bootstrapping your way to prosperity, is technically true but almost completely misleading. The real story is stranger, more uncomfortable, and far more interesting. It starts with a dictator and a phone call to Wall Street. The year is 1961. General Park Chung-hee has just seized power in a military coup. South Korea is surviving mostly on American aid. The government is a mess, the economy is barely functioning, and foreign investors want nothing to do with the place. Park looks at this situation and makes a decision that would seem insane to most modern economists. Instead of opening the market and letting competition sort things out, he does the opposite. He picks winners, literally. He sits down with a small group of Korean business families and says, in effect, we are going to build an industrial economy from nothing. And you are going to be the ones who do it, and the government is going to help you every step of the way. These families became the chaebols: Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, LG, Lot. And the deal was simple and brutal. The government gives you cheap loans, protects you from foreign competition, and hands you government contracts. In return, you export, you grow, you hire Koreans, and you hit the targets we set. Miss the targets and the loans dry up. The relationship was not a partnership. It was closer to a leash. This is not how capitalism is supposed to work. There are no free markets here, no invisible hand, just a government deciding which industries would exist, which companies would lead them, and then throwing the full weight of the state behind making that happen. And somehow it worked. Here is what makes it actually work, because a lot of countries have tried versions of this and failed spectacularly. The difference is exports. Park was obsessed with them. The entire model was built around selling things to other countries. Not just producing domestically, not just substituting imports, selling to the world. Why does that matter? Because the world is a brutal judge. You can fool a government committee. You cannot fool a German buyer who has 18 other options. Exporting forced Korean companies to actually compete, to actually improve, to actually get good. The government support was the runway, but the export markets were the pressure that turned that runway into something real. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, South Korea was exporting textiles, then steel, then ships, then cars, then semiconductors, each industry more complex and more valuable than the last. They were essentially running a national training program disguised as an economy. The other ingredient was education, and this one is not a myth. South Korean families spent an almost alarming share of their income on their children's schooling. The literacy rate climbed, universities expanded. Engineers and scientists poured into industries that needed them. Human capital, economists call it, which is a cold phrase for something that was actually a cultural obsession, a near-religious belief that education was the path out. Take those two things together, forced competitiveness through export discipline and a highly educated workforce, and the economic growth rates start to make more sense. South Korea averaged around 9% GDP growth per year for 3 decades. That is not a rounding error. That is the kind of number that transforms countries. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. The chaebols grew and kept growing. By the 1990s, Samsung alone was responsible for something like 20% of South Korea's entire export revenue. Hyundai was building ships, cars, construction projects, and financial products. These were not companies anymore in the conventional sense. They were economic ecosystems. Entire towns existed. Because a single chaebol needed workers, and because they had grown so large, so intertwined with the government, so essential to the economy, they became something that economists have a name for: too big to fail. The loans kept coming because the alternative, letting one of these giants collapse, was unthinkable. Banks were effectively arms of government policy. Debt piled up inside the chaebols, hidden behind complex cross-shareholding structures where one subsidiary would guarantee the loans of another, which would guarantee another a financial house of cards held together by the assumption that the government would never let it fall. Then came 1997, the Asian financial crisis. Foreign investors started pulling money out of emerging markets. The Thai baht collapsed, panic spread, and suddenly the assumptions underpinning the entire Korean model were exposed. Korean companies had borrowed in foreign currencies, mostly dollars, assuming the Korean won would stay stable. It did not. The won crashed, the debt in dollar terms doubled almost overnight. Daewoo, one of the largest chaebols in the world, collapsed entirely. It was carrying 30 times more debt than equity. 30 times, South Korea had to go to the IMF, hat in hand, for a $57 billion bailout. The conditions were humiliating, interest rates spiked, unemployment tripled in a year. Families sold their gold jewelry to help stabilize the currency. There are photographs of people lined up outside collection centers, handing over wedding rings and necklaces, a country trying to save itself with its own heirlooms. What happened next is the part the success story usually skips. South Korea recovered rapidly again. Within 2 years, it had paid back much of the IMF loan. Within a decade, it was one of the world's leading technology exporters. The crisis was real, but the recovery was genuine. New industries emerged. The Korean wave, the cultural export of K-pop, cinema, and television, became a soft power phenomenon that nobody predicted and nobody fully understands. Bong Joon-ho wins the Oscar, BTS sells out stadiums in Brazil, Korean skincare products end up in bathroom cabinets in Ohio. This is not an accident exactly, but it is also not a plan anybody wrote down. But the chaebols never really got reformed. That is the quiet truth underneath the recovery. Samsung is now more powerful relative to the Korean economy than it was before the crisis. The founding families still control these conglomerates through ownership. Structures so complex that untangling them requires a specialist. Corruption trials involving chaebol heirs are practically a recurring feature of Korean public life. The heir to Samsung has been convicted of bribery. The heir to Lot spent time in prison. And yet the companies continue because the alternative remains unthinkable. Young Koreans are caught inside a system that produced extraordinary national wealth but distributes it in ways that feel increasingly closed. Housing in Seoul is among the least affordable in the world. The path to a stable career runs almost entirely through a handful of elite universities and then ideally a chaebol job. The birth rate in South Korea is the lowest ever recorded for any country in peacetime history. Not a low birth rate, the lowest. Young people have done the math on what it costs to build a life there, and many have decided it does not add up. So here is the actual question that South Korea leaves you with. It proved that a poor country can become a rich one within a single lifetime, that industrialization can be deliberate, that the state can shape an economy with intention and produce results. That is genuinely remarkable, that matters. But it also produced a system where the families who built the machine now essentially own it, where the wealth is real but the access to it narrows every generation, where the young people born into one of the economic miracles of the 20th century are choosing, in growing numbers, not to have children at all. Is that a success story? It depends entirely on who you ask, and more importantly, it depends on when.